For me, one of the really key rights when thinking about the future of technology is our right to freedom of thought and how we protect that.
You're listening to the Futures Podcast live from EngageWorks' Flux Innovation Lounge, a showcase of new technology ripped directly from the pages of science fiction and presented just a stone's throw from the O2 Arena. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, and others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this evening. Today's generative AI tools seem to threaten human creativity more than they offer to increase human productivity. As such, these burgeoning technologies are fast redefining the essence of what it means to be human by impacting what we think, but more importantly, how we think. Thankfully, my guest today, international human rights lawyer Susie Alegre, is expertly placed to show us that our best defense against the dehumanizing effects of artificial intelligence might be found in our current understanding of human rights. In her upcoming book, Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, she calls for a more considered development, deployment, and governance of AI and robotics. And in doing so, she gives a pathway for us to reassert our collective humanity by embracing regulation that allows us to harness the benefits of emerging technologies whilst mitigating the risks. So, to help us ensure that progress does not come at the expense of our most cherished human values and, most importantly, freedoms, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Susie Alegre to the Futures Podcast stage. Thank you firstly for being here, and thank you for your absolutely fantastic book. And I want to start with that tricky acronym, UDHR, otherwise known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why do you think that could be possibly our first line of defense against artificial intelligence?
Well, I think just to give a bit of the background on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and where it came from. Last year, the UDHR was 75 years old. So we're celebrating 75 years of having this global blueprint on what human rights and freedoms mean. And so if you think back 75 years, what we were looking at was humanity reeling after the Second World War and the atrocities of the Holocaust, and really trying to set down what were the vital things that we need as humans to make sure that could never happen again. What is the baseline of what everybody everywhere needs to be human and to flourish with dignity as a human being? If you go back and look at it, and I'd highly recommend to go back and look at the UDHR and see what rights it contains. While we often hear in the media about human rights as sort of being problematic or outdated or difficult, I think anyone would be very hard-pressed to find anything in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that they would not want for themselves and their family, and their friends. So I think it's really key to go back to this idea of what are human rights and why do they matter and what are they a bulwark against. And one of the things I found really interesting when I was researching the UDHR and the sort of background to it was seeing that even Albert Speer, who was Hitler's minister for armaments, at his trial in Nuremberg, where he offered up at least some contrition and recognition of the horrors that he had been part of, commented that every country in the world was at risk of technocratic autocracy, and that the only bulwark against that was fundamental freedoms and human rights, and that it was absolutely vital to prevent it happening again, that we remember that. And I think it's very interesting when you look at what he said. He was talking about the risks of technology in autocratic regimes and systems. It's nothing new. It's exactly what the UDHR was drawn up to prevent.
Well, the UDHR, it's such an important document. It's a historical document, but it is still relevant today. But given the sorts of technologies we have today compared to back in the 1940s, where do you think it's insufficient? Where do you think it could need perhaps improvement?
To be honest, I don't think there is necessarily a need for improvement as such. What's needed is really interpretation and application. And I mean, one of the things about the UDHR is that it is a declaration. It's not hard law. But most of the human rights laws that we have, and many other laws that don't necessarily have human rights written on the tin, have been designed to protect the rights that are in the UDHR. And one of the things I think is important about the UDHR, and the reason why I write about it as the baseline, is that it was collectively recognised and accepted globally. It's something that everybody agreed that everybody needs. And that's not necessarily the case when you look at regional human rights instruments. But what I think we do need is the development of using human rights law more directly in the ways that we address regulation, but also in the ways that we think about technology, and actually thinking about, what could possibly go wrong when you start designing, which is obviously, not necessarily how people want to look at things. When you're feeling innovative, you don't want someone to turn up and say, have you thought about the worst that could happen? But human rights law kind of says, you really need to think about those risks and to mitigate.
Should we let the non-humans in the room when we're talking about human rights? Can AI perhaps assist with adapting how we utilize these human rights in an age where we may have to encounter non-humans?
I think in principle, there may be use cases for AI that can help to protect human rights. I have to say that in most of the use cases I've seen where people are talking about tech for good, it's partly going back to what Shinny was saying about lack of perspective, that you'll find people talking about things as a great idea because from their perspective, they are a great idea because they haven't understood other perspectives. So one example is, for example, I was talking to people a couple of years ago about idea of digital ID. And I was in a room where I was the only woman. All the other people were middle-aged European men. And they were saying, no, it's fine. It's all very secure. And you only give it away if you consent. And I'm saying, well, what happens if, you're a 12-year-old girl in a refugee camp and you're not going to get food if you don't consent to give away your digital ID, or somebody is threatening to hurt your children if you don't give away your digital ID. And it was very clear that from the perspective of the people I was talking to, they couldn't understand situations where they might be coercively controlled. It just wasn't going in. It was just, well, it's all about consent. And so I think that is where it's really important that even when you're looking at technology for good or to promote human rights, that you need to have a variety of perspectives in the room to understand those loopholes and the horrendous consequences that could happen if you don't think about those loopholes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the problem space here that you're addressing through the use of human rights in your book. We hear a lot about the differentiated forms of threats that AI offers, but to you, what are the key threats?
I'm not particularly concerned about the existential risk issues, if I'm honest. For me, it's very much looking about the things that are already happening. And so if we look at things like disinformation, the information environment, the fact that these days we all pretty much get our information online, it's increasingly difficult to actually know whether the information we're getting is reliable and why it's being given to us, why we're being targeted, why we're receiving the information that we're getting, and what that then does for our ability to think for ourselves. And so that's where, for me, one of the really key rights when thinking about the future of technology is our right to freedom of thought and how we protect that. And what you'll see in the way technology has been developed, particularly in the last 10 years, is that a lot of technological innovation is about trying to get inside our heads, understand how we think and feel, use that information to then go back inside and change how we think and feel, to alter how we behave, or to categorize us in ways that might penalize us. So it's very difficult, if you like, to think at all about the future when we don't know how to think, if we've lost control of reliable information, because we need reliable information to be able to think for ourselves.
Well, that's the wonderful irony in your book, that to think critically about AI is a great challenge, because AI is causing the issues and the blockers to thinking critically in itself, to think critically, to form opinions freely, and to produce original creative works. And it's original creative works that I want to talk a little bit about, considering we're here at Engage Works at a design studio, because that's where we can start utilizing this framework to do the real work, to understand how AI is affecting the creative industries, for example.
Yeah, I mean, my second book that's coming out in May, the real thing that triggered it was ChatGPT, if I'm honest, and the beginning of 2023.
Was it also the thing that wrote it?
I'll leave you to decide. It's usually fairly obvious if ChatGPT wrote it, or at least it was in early 2023.
It wasn't ChatGPT. Yeah. It was beautifully written. Sorry.
But yeah, it was this sense, this sort of overwhelming feeling, which I don't know if there are other creatives in the room, but it literally made me feel sick, what I was seeing online, the complete dismissal and failure to understand what being creative is. And, for me, I grew up telling myself stories, writing stories. I think I won my first literary prize about a hedgehog family when I was about 7 at school. And the idea that I would get AI to write stories for me, or that, that this was a force for good, and that then it's great because then we won't have to bother writing stuff ourselves, was really, it was a horror story for me. So I wanted to explore that, engage with it, and see what I thought it meant. And I think, it's always quite complicated looking at these things, because, you don't want to just push back because what about me? But it's about, well, what does it mean for human creativity? And I think one thing we've seen, certainly in recent years, and maybe it was always the case, that it's very hard to make a living doing anything creative. But, as a writer, it was, I think in 2022, the ALCS did research on writers' incomes. So these are professional writers working full-time as writers in the UK in 2022. Does anybody want to have a guess at how much they were earning annually?
I would say it's like any other art, so it probably below the minimum wage anyway.
50 grand.
50?
23.
23? Any advance on 23?
25.
12? No. 7. 7,000. And with that, there's also a 40% discrepancy between men and women. So, if you want something written cheaply, just ask a woman writer. Do not design an AI system to do it for you. So there's already a big problem in the arts. And talking about solving problems, for me, the last thing the arts needs to solve their problems is ChatGPT. But one of the things that I found interesting then, talking to other people who were exploring generative AI, was that the people that I found who thought it was great generally came into 2 categories. One category was non-native English speakers who have to write text in English for their day job, but who speak English quite well, but it's definitely a lot quicker to get it done with ChatGPT and then sort of correct it. And the second lot of people were people who have to produce content because of the way the internet works. So because of the way the internet works, if you've got an underwear shop online, you have to be constantly producing engaging content so that the algorithm will send people your way. If anyone's on LinkedIn, this idea that you have to be constantly creating engaging content that you can't be bothered to do, but now you can get ChatGPT to do it for you, and it'll also message people for you. So it's about people who've been sort of forced into content creation, but who actually don't want to do content creation. In my view, actually, if you could, put those two groups of people, the people who like creating and the people who have to have content, and get one to pay the other to do it for them instead of paying a machine, then we would be looking at solutions to problems for creatives.
Well, is there a mindset change with how we view AI? Do we need to see it more as a collaborator? And if so, is there something within the human rights framework that allows us to I guess, harness AI for productivity, but not necessarily let it take our jobs or our creativity?
I think there is. I think, when I started again to research for the book, when you look at things like the right to work, the rights to unionize, the rights to strike, all of these things in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, you can see that actually what it gives us as societies is key tools to decide how we want to work, what we want our communities to look like. And I think one of the problems we have with the way AI is being sold is that it's being sold as a cure-all. And I remember waking up in the morning listening to the Radio 4 after the AI Safety Summit to hear Elon Musk reassuringly telling me that I wouldn't need to work anymore and that AI could be my best friend. And I'm thinking, I don't want either of those things. I actually, I enjoy working and I like my friends. So I think there's a real question about what do we want AI for? And we don't need it to do everything all the time. We need to decide what use cases it's good for, both as individuals, but also for societies.
Well, going back to the idea of perhaps value. Now, AI art, it's being created, it's already out there, there's a multitude of different tools that you can use, but will we as human beings ever see the cultural value in that? In the same way that we have cultural heritage for human-made artworks or even buildings or spaces and places?
I think there might be. I mean, there are some artists who are doing incredible work with AI and using AI to effectively show the issues about AI in society, if you like. So they're using it very much to make artistic points. So there are definitely useful and interesting creative ways that AI is being used in the arts. And it's very difficult to tell what we will think about it in the future. And again, going back to the distant past, Socrates was famously very against the written word because he thought it would, dull our minds and we wouldn't be able to remember anything, which, may be one of the reasons I have problems remembering people's names. But, Socrates, clearly, we wouldn't have heard of Socrates if no one had written about him. He would have disappeared into the annals of time. So I think with AI and creativity, there will be ways that it will be used and that it will revitalize creativity. But it can't replace humanity. And I think what we're going to land up with is a position where, human-made art will be a luxury item that probably only tech billionaires will be able to afford to buy, while the rest of us will be getting, the artistic equivalent of lift music is what's available and surrounding us. And so, there are arguments about, again, what do we want it to do? Where do we want it? How do we want to use it? So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing question. But I think the other thing, which is often not really talked about, is the massive environmental and power costs of AI. So every time you make a funny meme or do a video or, get ChatGPT to write a poem for you for LinkedIn, you are using large amounts of power, large amounts of water, and that is not being replenished. And so there's a kind of big question about just using it for fun, all the stuff that's happening in the background that we're not aware of at the moment.
Yeah, well, one of our last live episodes was with Corinne Kath and Fike Jensen, and they were talking exactly about that. On one hand, the EU has these climate policies where they want to reduce the amount of energy they're using, but on the other hand, they have an AI policy that requires the opening of a multitude of data centers that require both power and water, the two resources that they're trying to protect against. So there does feel like there's this cognitive dissonance when it comes to governance. And I want to turn to governance and law and legal and ask whether those are viable forms of resistance to some of these things. I know you said there it's not either or, but can we and can, I guess, creative industries Can they adapt, regulate, or protect against the encroachment of AI?
I think one of the most important tools is access to justice. And so being able to actually enforce the laws that are there. Because one of the big things around big tech and AI is that there's been this narrative that regulation is too slow to catch up, the law can't catch up. I don't think that's true. In most cases, the laws are there, they're just being ignored, and it costs a lot of money to enforce them and a lot of time. And so you do see things, things are starting to catch up. You see things like the FTC in the US, who are, now starting to really flex their muscles and use penalties like, I think it's called, program disgorgement, I think, where effectively they order the whole system to be destroyed if it's found to be illegal. Well, that then, creates a real risk and makes people focus their minds on getting it right before they invest tons of money in something that may well just be destroyed by a legal order. So I think the law does give us that possibility, but it's only if we have access to justice that we will make the law stick.
Well, in the interim, are there perhaps creative interventions that are being done by artists to resist the way in which AI is repurposing their work?
Yes, I think one of my favourite sort of interactions between technologists and artists was the development of two tools. One of them is called Glaze, which allows artists to effectively put a digital protective glaze over their work when they post it online to stop it being scraped by tools feeding AI. And then on top of that, if you really want to go for it, you can add an extra layer, which is called Nightshade, where if the AI does scrape your images, then it will effectively be poisoned. And so it's a way of ultimately destroying the system from within. And I think that's a really fascinating area. I mean, it remains to be seen, how the law will deal with that. I suspect someone will probably start challenging that from the opposite end.
Yeah, unfortunately, coming down the side of OpenAI rather than the side of artists in that respect. But these issues that always come up when we have this discussion about creativity and how it collides, I guess, with AI. The keywords are copyright, ownership, and originality. But thankfully, as you prove in your upcoming book, the UDHR, that has articles in it that can help us deal with those complicated issues.
Absolutely. I mean, Article 27 of the UDHR, which you hardly ever hear spoken about sort of as a human right, but it actually gives artists moral and economic rights in their work. So moral rights, sort of the right to be recognised for your work. It also gives communities access to science. And I think that's what's really important, is that there is this protection of, if you like, the totality of human innovation, and to make sure that it's there for our societies. One of the things that I really noticed when I started looking at ChatGPT out of my despair was that I did what a lot of people in my LinkedIn area did, was ask ChatGPT who I was, which of course it basically said I was nobody. Which is fine. I was, a bit hurt. But anyway, so then I asked it, well, who wrote Freedom to Think, which was my first book? And it came back with, I think it was an Australian biologist first. And so I was like, well, no. And I went and checked. No, he hadn't written that book. And I asked it again and again and again. And it gave me 20 different names. And all the names were men, all white men. And the only one woman I got was a woman called Dr. Bobby Stevens. And I assume that that's because
just two
she was
male
probably
names.
two men. Yes, so she was a man squared as far as ChatGPT was concerned, because only men would think about, freedom of thought and these sort of profound issues. But then when I asked it if it could write in the style of Susie Alegre, it was very happy to do that. And it even really helpfully said it could do a better job if I fed it some more copyrighted work that it could use use as a model. And what was interesting as well was that it gave synopses of the book. So it clearly had come across the book somewhere, or at least reviews or something, but it didn't ascribe it to me. So that kind of question of moral rights, I think we'll find increasingly with what is effectively automated plagiarism and, the erasure of women from their own work.
When it comes, again, to the process of education, I'm seeing at the University of Warwick undergraduate students using ChatGPT to write their essays, essentially. Now, the smart ones, they pay for ChatGPT-4, and then they upload all the papers they should have read, and then they get it to write an essay that's at least referencing things that are real.
Yeah.
So, but learning from that, it makes me realize that there are ways to use these tools as collaborative, and there are ways for us to teach the next generation to use their critical thinking skills to critique what they're receiving from these seemingly authoritative AI tools.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question of using it effectively as a tool to take apart the argument that you're being given by ChatGPT and to describe why it's potentially wrong. I think as well, from an education perspective, I think it's going to be a real struggle. But one ray of hope for me is that what it will mean is that the way we educate people, the way we learn, will turn into a much more interactive exercise. Because clearly the essay is dead. There's no point in sending someone off to write an essay in 2024. But actually then having a discussion live and engage, much more interpersonal engagement, I think could be the upside.
Yeah, practice-based research, make a thing and then respond to the thing as the form of your essay, because it's very hard for ChatGPT to understand what the thing is that is out in the world. Otherwise. Now, Susie, you are in the legal profession, and we all heard the news and the rumours that the legal profession's over. We don't need lawyers anymore. Great. They're not going to become cheaper, but we won't need them anymore. But obviously, you have an insider view on that, and that is speculation. Do you think there are some risks to the legal profession of AI entering that profession? And equally, are there any benefits, perhaps, of integrating AI?
There's definitely a lot of sales on law tech. Whether or not any of it would replace actual lawyers, I am much more skeptical. And I think what's going to be interesting is the cases brought by lawyers when the law tech drops them in it at some point in the future. Because I saw an interesting piece of research just before Christmas where there were generative AI models. I can't remember which ones. There were 2 or 3 of them where they trained it on federal judgments. So they were actual judgments, and asked them to analyze or to say what the judgment said. So there's a real judgment. They fed it, asked what it says. Apparently, they got it wrong between 69 and 88% of the time.
Wow.
And that's not fed on rubbish from across the internet. That's fed on actual judgments and asked to analyze them. So I think we're a long way off having to worry too much about it. But on the flip side, you land up with people like, I think the last one, again, just before Christmas, was Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, whose pro bono lawyer in his criminal case apparently used ChatGPT to write the pleadings. And unfortunately, most of the cases cited were non-existent. And it was just, the latest in a string of, particularly out of the US, we've seen these headlines of lawyers turning up at court with pleadings based on cases that just don't exist. So I think we'll probably see quite a bit more of that. Whether or not that will shore up the position of lawyers for the future, I don't know.
Well, it certainly feels like there's a long way to go and a lot more innovation to be done. But if we are to make the argument that human beings are fundamentally special, they sit in a plane beyond something that AI can replicate, what do you think it is that is the value add of being a human in the 21st century?
I think the value out of being a human is the capacity to change, the capacity to be perverse, the capacity to decide things differently. I think the thing that really gives me hope is that we do have that capacity. We still have the opportunity to choose and to choose what it is that we think is important about being us, each other, and our communities.
Well, on that exact note, is there perhaps one piece of advice that you would give our audience to ensure they can stay human in the age of AI?
I'd say just think very carefully when you're using AI about why you're using it, what it's for, and what the consequences of you using it might be. And they may not be very obvious just yet. But the one concrete example I'd say of that is when you use Google Maps, which I admit I did use just around here, but it took me the wrong way, although we got here in the end, is that Google Maps apparently is actually affecting our brains and our ability to find our way in the real world. So if you think that that's happening just with following GPS, what on earth is it doing to our brains to rely on them to write our essays, to think our thoughts, and to create our ideas for the future?
Wow. Okay, so preserve your thoughts before it's too late and something else does the thinking for you. On that note, I just want to thank you for joining us on the Futures Podcast Live. You can pre-order Susie's new book, Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, by visiting susiealegre.com. Her 2022 book, Freedom to Think, Protecting a Fundamental Human Right in the Digital Age, is available now. I want to take this moment to say a massive thank you to EngageWorks for hosting us today. You can find out more about Flux Innovation Lounge at engageworks.com/flux. If you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures Podcast on your favorite podcasting app or follow us on social media at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking the wonderfully insightful Susie Alegre to the Futures Podcast.